I want to make sure that you understand that throughout the textbook, there's information about aging neurons or aging systems in the neuroanatomy. There's also important information about developmental structures. We won't spend a lot of time on them in the second half of the semester, so I'm not really going to cover them in our lectures, but feel free to cover them. We're going to now focus a little bit more on cranial nerves. We already talked about spinal nerves. These are both part of the peripheral nervous system. We'll talk about some different regions of the brain. So we'll look at them from different angles. So we'll look at them from the lateral or side view. We'll look at them from the dorsal and the ventral view. And then we're also going to look briefly at the mid-sagittal surface of the brain. This slide shows you some of the structures that are located on the brainstem. The brainstem is just like they explained it before. You probably heard this. It's right at the base of the brain. And it basically connects the spinal cord to the rest of the regions of the brain. So the spinal cord, if you look up here, is going to be connecting right on the bottom here, and then that connects up to other regions of the brainstem. I'll talk more about those. You can see all of these colors here are going to correlate to different types of cranial nerves, right? There's 12 different ones, and we use Roman numerals to notate each of them. Each one of them has a specific name. We'll talk a little bit about how we can group them together by different functions, but you can see some of this on the right. There are sensory cranial nerves. There are motor cranial nerves, which only have sensory or motor function. And then there's a number of them here in green that you can see that have both incoming and outgoing information. They're both sensory and motor function. Now, there are pairs of these, just like we saw in the spinal cord when we looked at spinal nerves. And each of these plays roles typically in mostly regions around the neck and face. There are some cranial nerves that I'll talk about that play a role in innervating regions in the body, namely the vagal nerve that we'll talk a little bit about later on. But most of them play roles sort of around the face, a lot of the special senses like hearing or vision, taste, that kind of thing. And many of them play important roles in movement of the eye. And I'll spend some time looking at those. The brainstem is the most critical region of the brain in the sense that if you damage regions that are located more inferior on the brain, they will have massive effects on survivability. So individuals who have any kind of medulla oblongata or basal regions here, lateral regions here that are damaged, you're going to see that that can create comas and even death in these individuals. As we lead up further and further towards the midbrain and then to the cerebrum, you're going to see that the structures have more special types of functions. And so those regions don't have as many functions. So down here in the medulla, for instance, swallowing, breathing, your heart rate, all those kinds of things are controlled here. But as we start moving up, some of those aren't as important. And then that means that if damage happens higher up in the brain, it's more likely that it won't cause permanent damage or death in those individuals. But the more inferior we are, the more important it is to keep in mind those structures are incredibly important at the base of the brainstem and in the interface of the spinal cord and brainstem. So as a structure in whole, you can see here, this is the brainstem. There are three main regions, the medulla oblongata, which is the most inferior region down here. And you can see that all these yellow structures that are on here are just like the colored structures we saw in the last one. These are pairs of cranial nerves. If you haven't learned them before, we're not going to have to learn them all, but I do want you to get an idea of what they do as far as function goes. And remember, there are pairs of each of them. There's also the pons, right? And that's this region located right here. It is literally the footbridge over the brainstem. And then the midbrain that we are going to see up here that play a role in structures like the diencephalon, and very importantly, the thalamus, which we'll call like central station, where all incoming sensory information mostly comes through and then funnels out to different portions of the cerebrum or other parts of the brain, and then all information that's going in a descending fashion and a motor function is going to come back through the thalamus. It's a sorting area for the brain. There are 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that arise in and around the brainstem. The other two pairs we'll talk about a little bit later on. And damage, again, to that small areas of the brainstem can cause death if it's more inferior, okay? And we'll talk about things like control of breathing, but also being awake, right, conscious, the reticular formation, other things that are located down in these more distal regions and inferior regions of the brain. It's important to note that the medulla oblongata has a continuous alignment with the spinal cord, and it contains both ascending information from the spinal cord and descending tracts. The ascending are typically sensory information, the descending are motor function. There are two main regions that you should know. The medullary nuclei are the ones that regulate heart rate, blood vessels, breathing, swallowing, and so on and so forth. Notice all the different ones here. Whereas the pyramids are, and you saw those on the last slide also in yellow, are controlling voluntary muscle movement. So your conscious control of muscle movement. The pons, as being more, in this case, more superior, has also ascending and descending tracts. They continue through the pons, and they have a region called the pontine nuclei. Now, these are called nuclei because they're not distinct structures, right? They are a series of neurons in a region that play a similar role. These regulate breathing, swallowing, balance, chewing, and salivation, which you see also above. But you can see that that list has grown a little bit smaller. And that's because they're becoming more specialized. There's less and less of these pathways here. So again, the damage of the medulla oblongata level is a really bad place to have damage. The corpora quadrigemina is a region that has 4 colliculi involved in hearing and visual cues. We'll spend a lot of time looking at these. So those corpora quadrigemina, quadra meaning 4 of them. The 2 inferior are involved in hearing, and that's important to remember because we'll come back to the special senses later. And the 2 superior colliculi are involved in visual reflexes. It's also important to note that the substantia nigra, which we've talked a little bit about before, important in Parkinson's and dopaminergic responses, will be very important. We'll come back to that one. The red nucleus, both of the substantia nigra and the red nucleus help in body movements. And then the cerebral peduncles are the major descending motor pathway, and they basically can connect the brain stem to the cerebrum. This is a nice summary slide of all the cranial nerves. Notice, as I indicated to you before, each cranial nerve has a Roman numeral associated with it. The ones that are most, we'll spend a lot of time on are cranial nerves number 1 and 2, which are olfactory or sense of smell, and our optic nerve or sense of vision. And you can see up here whether they have sensory or motor function. They're each more sensory function, and they're the sense of smell and vision, as I indicated to you. And then every one of these below that you can see plays different roles. Some of them are only motor function. Some of them are sensory and motor function. One of the important ones that we'll spend a little time looking at is the facial nerve, which is important in Bell's palsy. We'll also talk about the vagal nerve, one of the longest nerves in your body, which doesn't serve, as I indicated to you before, just around the face and the neck. It serves to regions down all along the autonomic nervous system and in the gut. And then we'll see a little bit more about a number of these play a role in how your tongue tastes things and moves, as well as your eye, which moves. And so lots of these cranial nerves play roles in those functions. So I kind of separated this out for you to this is a great slide because it kind of pulls things together. So cranial nerves number 1, 2, and 8 are all your special senses ones. We'll spend a lot of time on these 3. So these would be important ones to go and find where they are on the brain and kind of note where they are. And we'll come back to them later on. So cranial nerve number 1 is smell or olfaction. Cranial nerve number 2 is vision. And cranial nerve number 8 is that hearing and balance. It's important for both, and we'll spend a lot of time, this vestibulocochlear nerve. Cranial nerves number 3, 4, and 6, absolutely imperatively interesting. All of them are involved in the eye movements, right? And there will be a lot of really interesting studies that we can do on these cranial nerves to look at brain damage and use this as a way to note where the brain damage may have occurred. Cranial nerves number 5, 10, and 11 are important for chewing, digestion, and muscles in the throat. And those are ones that we'll spend a lot of time on. And then cranial nerves number 7, 9, and 12 are all important in tongue movement, right? And how the tongue tastes. So these are incredibly, it's a nice summary slide that you should spend some time looking over. So how do we test to see if lesion or damage happens in a cranial nerve? So one way we can do this is if the olfactory system is affected, we can look at sense of smell. We do a standard odor test. And the optic nerve, we can look to see whether there's pupillary light reflexes. One of the main things that most doctors do when they look in your eyes is to make sure that you have pupillary light reflexes. And we can look at things like how your ear functions. We have tuning fork activities. We can look at have your follow a finger. There's so many different ones here that play a role. But I thought this was a nice summary slide that kind of tells you when they're looking to see how your different reflexes work and they look how different muscles work, what they're really interpreting is, do you have normal function of all those cranial nerves? And these tests play a very important role in noting, like after a brain trauma, where the brain trauma may have occurred without doing any kind of work as far as MRIs. They can do these kinds of studies if the person's conscious and sometimes even unconscious to determine what kind of brain damage might have occurred. Because remember, these reflexes, the person doesn't have to be conscious. It's also important to note that there are a lot of internal organizations of the brainstem. So if you go back here to that prior slide, you can see each of these different type of cranial nerves, the somatic ones, the branchial ones, the visceral ones, the ones that fit into the body, are all sort of separated out. And this time, we're looking at very important type of horizontal basically dissections here, and you could see different regions here. Now, you don't have to know all of these, but you're going to hear some of them over the semester. So you're going to hear about the facial nuclei and the trigeminal, and you'll hear a little bit about the abducens nucleus. But it's just important to have these as a reference point and come back to them a little bit later on because they're often paired off on opposite sides of the brain, and in this case, the brain stem. This is just showing you more of those located sort of a little bit more superior in the upper medulla region. And this one's looking at lateral views of the brain. So the superior, the lateral, the dorsal views, inferior views, all of them give us different information. Again, you can see all those raised structures, those gyri, all of them are named. We know what all of them do, basically, what regions of the cerebrum do different things. If you take and spread out along the lateral sulcus here, you can actually see this fifth specific lobe here. It's not really a lobe, but many often talk about it. It's called the insula. We'll talk a little bit more about the insula later on. At the base of the brainstem are these pairs of structures called the cerebellum. Very important structures. We'll talk more about those very soon. And also note that there's some other gyri and sulci here that play a role, and we'll come back to those over time as well. This is just showing you again some of those other views, looking at the dorsal, ventral, inferior, superior views. It's important to note I mentioned the idea that we can separate along the central sulcus, right? But we can also separate, as I'm showing you right now, the two cerebral hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere, using something called the longitudinal fissure. Very important structure. And you can see the brainstem on this inferior view here. And you can see again our two cerebellum off to the side here. As we move forward, then we can see things like the pons, right? And we can come and we can see some of our cranial nerves, like our olfactory nerves here. This was right above the nose. We'll talk a little bit about the optic chiasm. This is where all of the optic nerves are coming into and disseminate then information to the occipital lobe, which we see up here, is where the visual cortex is that receives that information.